Hello, everyone.
Hi
Morning.
everyone, morning Phil.
Morning,
Steve.
Jord. Oh, hi, Steve.
Good morning, guys.
Welcome back to our Psalms videos for difficult times. By now I'm sure you know who Phil and I are, but as you can see we have a third guest on like last week, and this morning we've got Steve with us. It's great to have you on, Steve.
Great to be with you, chaps.
And today Steve is carrying on with our Psalms, and today he's going to be sharing some thoughts on Psalm 4, which is really exciting, and we're looking forward to that, Steve. Before we do that, I'm just going to share my screen, and we're just going to have a quick look at where we are in our big picture of the whole book of Psalms, something that we discovered in our first session together. So hopefully you can now see my screen.
All good.
All right, lads. Yeah, super. So yeah, we're thinking about Psalm 4. We, in the first few sessions, looked at the prologue in Psalm 1 and 2, and those wonderful invitations that God is offering to the individual and the collective. And then last week, Sam kicked us off in some thoughts around Psalm 3, and we looked at how that salvation belongs to God and how we can take great comfort in that. And again, this is the second book of book 1. In those lament psalms of David, a lot of them are, as we might see today, as we'll allude to in a moment with the title. And we just want to pick up on that idea in a minute of CPT and what that means and how that can relate to our psalms. So we're still in book 1, we're still in those lament psalms. So if we just go on to our next slide, we'll have a little read through of this psalm now. I might just have to ask Phil to read. Oh, actually, I can read it from my Bible. So let's just read Psalm 4 together before we dive into some thoughts. And I've put the little psalm pattern icon on that you can see. I've made sure I've not put them in the top right of the screen this week because obviously with our faces on, you can't see that.
Yes, thanks for those who provided that feedback. All the feedback welcome.
Definitely. So let's read Psalm 4. And when I'm reading, try and notice the CPT. Remember, that's complaint, plea, and trust that sort of appears in this psalm. So Psalm 4. To the choir master with stringed instruments, a psalm of David. Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You've given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. O men, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? Selah. But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. Be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your own hearts on your beds and be silent. Selah. Offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, who will show us some good? Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. You've put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. In peace, I will both lie down and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. So just before I hand over to Steve, we've just put the title of that. We've put that as a psalm pattern because hopefully in one of the future sessions, Phil or I, or maybe a guest speaker will do a little session on those titles. But perhaps we can, like last week, suggest that this was a psalm that was written for David, or maybe a psalm that David wrote himself, and we can think about that maybe in the context as well. So I'm now going to hand over to Steve to share his thoughts on Psalm 4.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for having me here to give some thoughts on this. So, Psalm 4, it's a favourite of mine actually, and perhaps for others too. And the reason is for that verse that was so nicely sung at the beginning, comes right at the end about lying down in peace and sleeping. And for anybody that's had a bad night's sleep, and we all have for one reason or another, and in these times we're living in now, with, you know, people have a lot on their minds, and you can well understand why it can affect your sleep. This is a psalm that matters really for this this moment in our lives, and will again and again, because life always has its ups and downs, and we need help with that. And that's what this psalm is for. It's to help us. When we can't sleep, it's so very often because we've just got things on our mind, and we almost need to vocalize that. We're at our best often where we're talking about our thoughts, and we're somehow just getting everything out, because it's like one of those National Lottery pinball machines. Everything's bouncing around, and it's too much activity in the mind to let you switch off. So how do you deal with that when there's just too much going on in the mind? Well, David, when he writes this, he starts off with, in my version, it says, "Hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness." In the version we just read, ESV, it was, "Answer me when I call." Answer me, it's a stronger way of saying, "Hear me." It's a real plea to turn to God. And that's because we can talk to each other, and that is very helpful. But when you've got the opportunity to talk to God, well, who's going to turn that opportunity down, and who isn't going to want to hear back from God? And that's how David feels. When you're struggling, when you're in difficulty, you want to go to the highest source of power available to get some help in your life. And so that's why he's going to God, and he's saying, "Have mercy on me and hear my prayer." Like everyone, you know, who feels they can stand before God and make any sort of demands? And yet he says, "Have mercy on me." He knows his God is a merciful God, a God that loves him for all his faults, for all the things he gets right, but he gets things wrong too. He knows that he's cared for.
I think that's so helpful, Steve. And I love the honesty that you've sort of really pulled out of that verse, that David, or the psalmist, pleas to God in the prayer that he makes. And I think that's something to really reflect on, isn't it? That honesty. And yet in the middle of that sandwich, there's almost like that confidence that, yeah, you have given me relief when I was in distress, but you know, that honesty really sort of comes at the start and the end of that verse. So that was really helpful. And I love the imagery of the pinball machine as well.
Yeah. It's so very natural, and I think it's a good analogy, because when we let those thoughts get shared, other people can spot the ones, and even sometimes we can, as we're talking, we go, "Yeah, why have I had that thought?" And that thought, like a bad ball in the pinball machine, just gets taken away. It gets taken away, and it removes the clutter in our heads and the distraction. And we can see the cause of the issue in the next verses. So looking on at verses 2 and 3, we can see perhaps where David's problems lie, because he says that there are men around him that are turning glory to shame. They love worthlessness and falsehood. They're just not nice people, you know, and you've only got to switch on the TV. You know the sort of people we're talking about. Not everybody we meet in life do we get on with. Not everybody we meet in life has good intentions, unfortunately. So all of us are faced with the challenge in life of coming to terms with bad company. And bad company can mean all sorts of things. You know, it can mean getting, you know, somebody sort of bump into you on the street, right up to things that send people to jail. But David knows there's a difference, and he says in verse 3 that for all of this, God has set apart for himself people who are godly, and he says his God will hear when he calls to him. So he has confidence that in God's eyes, there is a right and a wrong, and the word righteousness gets used so very often in the Bible to describe this idea of right and wrong, what's good and what's bad. I can decide for myself what's right and wrong, and you might just do the same, but we may not agree. But what we do know is that the best source of justice and fairness and goodness comes from God. And so God's righteousness is the only way to really fairly arbitrate between people who are living right and people who are living wrong, and the behavior that belongs to both groups. So you've got two groups of people, is what he's saying. And he knows that God sees the group that are trying to do the right thing, and that God listens to them. And so really that's the beginning of his confidence, that he knows his God is a righteous God, and he has trust in him.
Yeah, and that's really helpful with the pattern that we've already alluded to, isn't it? That he's pleading to God, he's being honest with God, and yet the trust that David had in his God was still there. And I think saw that, didn't we, in the prologue of the whole book of Psalms, where David talked about where the psalmist in Psalm 1 talked about the wicked and the godly, and how there was two separate paths for those. And then we saw that on a bigger scale with the communal psalm in Psalm 2, and again now on this very personal psalm that, you know, is just a psalm between David and God, a prayer or a song possibly. We see that confidence come through again, that David has in this idea. So yeah, it's helpful, that, Steve.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all consistent with the same man that we're reading about in his other writings.
Yeah, I think it's powerful for me as well that he reflects on what God does listen. There's times you might feel God doesn't listen, but if you can think about either in your own life or the life of other faithful people that God did listen to them, it can give you that confidence when it doesn't really feel like at the time that God is listening to you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, sometimes we can make a request, but we might have to wait a little while too. So sometimes that's the hardest thing, isn't it? You know, it's the waiting. You know, I can go to I can go to a shopkeeper, or I can go to my boss at work and ask for something, but I don't always get it straight away. I might have to wait till the afternoon. I might have to wait a week. Depends what it is. Depends what I'm asking for. And the idea of waiting isn't something that anybody finds easy. And anyone who's got kids, you know, you look at kids, you see where this comes from in human nature. We want instant gratification, don't we? And it never really goes away. And we struggle with that idea. And very often, if we don't get the answer we want or the response we want, we take matters into our own hands. You know, a bit like a child behind its parents' back going into the kitchen and taking the chocolate or the biscuits. So what's the situation here? Well, when you feel injustice, when you're in a world where there are people doing you wrong, you want revenge, and that's natural. You know, we all understand that. And what's the response of David? What's his advice? What's he saying here? So if we look at verses 4 and 5, what does he say? He says, "Be angry and do not sin. Meditate within your heart on your bed and be still. Offer the sacrifices of righteousness and put your trust in the Lord." So let's try and break that down a bit. First of all, he's not taking away that right to feel angry. Okay, if there's some injustice in life, injustice will lead to anger. So anger's not a sin in itself. There's nothing wrong with feeling anger. In fact, there's places in the Bible where we read God himself gets angry. So to be angry is in effect to reflect the God who made us. What the problem is what you do with that anger. It's what you do with it. And the risk is you can go and do something you'll regret. And we've all done that. So we know what that's like. And that word anger that you read there in the Hebrew, it's describing anger with the sense that it's like agitation or trembling or shaking, almost like before a volcano blows. You know, it sort of rumbles. It's agitated, and so often that's what it's like, isn't it? When you get angry, you feel it sort of building up inside you, and it sort of almost takes over. Your head goes red, and you heat up, and your fists clench, and your knuckles go white, and then if you're not careful, something shoots out of your mouth, and it's like lava, and it will burn whatever's around you. And the problem is, like a volcano, it's indiscriminate, it just burns everything. And if you do blow your top, then you very often quickly regret it, because you know that you went too far, or your anger wasn't justified to say all the things that you said, and many things you said were just in the heat of the moment, and you regret them, and you wish you hadn't done it. And that's why he says, be angry and do not sin. Do not sin. Because if you let that anger control you, you've lost yourself, and you're not reflecting the God that made you anymore. And the thing that we have to learn as humans, which doesn't come easily, and it takes self-discipline, and it takes humility, and it takes courage, is to hold on to that anger, acknowledge it, let it be there, but not let it control you, and think very carefully about what you say and what you don't say, and what you do and what you do not do, so that you don't sin. And the best way to understand it ever is to follow the example of God. But what we are really needing to do is hand over injustice to God and let God deal with the things that we're not able to deal with. So I give a very extreme example: murder. Now, somebody might murder a friend of mine, and I might feel like murdering them back. That wouldn't be the right thing to do. And we know that two wrongs don't make a right. And in that situation, it can be very hard because you feel like your anger's got nowhere to go. You want your own sense of righteousness. But the detail is there for us in verse 5. It says, offer the sacrifices of righteousness and put your trust in the Lord. That if you're really going to be successful with managing this anger, you're going to have to make a sacrifice. That thing, you feel like you want to deal with this yourself. You want to do something back. You don't want sleepless nights about this. You want justice. And the sacrifice there is to actually go, I can't be the judge. I can't be the policeman. I'm not good enough. I need to give it to someone who'd make a better policeman, a better judge than me, who will give real justice. And you hand it over to God. And a sacrifice is where you give something up. You offer something up. And very often in the Old Testament, that's, sacrificing a lamb or something like that to, you're making it costs you something. You're showing that you're giving something up. And the cost here, when you're angry, is to give up revenge. That's the thing you want most in the world. That's precious to you. And to sacrifice that is the righteous thing to do, because it's right to give that feeling of injustice over to God and let him deal with it. And you know that he will, because he does deal with injustice. And if you go and look at Psalm 7, verse 11, it says there that God is a just judge and God is angry with the wicked every day. So if you needed to hear it somewhere else, there's a good example of it, that if you need a judge, if you need someone who understands your anger and will do the right thing with it, that's the place to go.
Yeah, it's very easy to just take things into your own hands, isn't it? When you feel that someone's wronged you, or you're cross, or they've hurt your pride or something. That volcano analogy is quite powerful. I'm just thinking of the explosion happening. You've been to New Zealand, haven't you, Steve, and seen some of those volcanic activities there, and a lot happens under the surface, and then suddenly,
that's it. So you think, where did that come from? And suddenly this geyser just goes, big jet of hot water and minerals goes up into the sky. Yeah, it's the language is quite strong, really.
I thought it was really helpful, the spiritual concept verse that you put up in Romans 12. We won't go there, but I think for people to have a look at that idea of being a living sacrifice, and it's all about transforming into a godly way of thinking, which is what we thought about in our first session with that whole picture of the Psalms, about how we're trying to get to that God-centered way of living, which is exactly what you just spoke on in being angry, but learning from how God deals with it. So I thought that was really helpful and perhaps something to look into.
It is such a big spiritual concept, as you say, Jord. All we've got in the Psalm at the moment is how to not lash out with the anger, but you might think, well, how am I supposed to act? Well, that might have to be one for another psalm, because the psalmist quite a few times in different psalms feels injustice, and we know here not to sin, but hopefully we can pick that up in other psalms as well. So how can you act?
Yeah. So, I mean, interestingly, we're looking at a volcano as one idea. We've got an opposite, which is a calm person on their bed meditating, and that's in verse 4. Now, after saying, be angry and do not sin, it then says, meditate within your heart on your bed and be still. And you could think of the idea of still waters, a nice calm lake where the waves have died down, all the tumultuous waters died down, and he's calm there. He's thinking things over on his bed, but he's got peace of mind because he's already made the decision in his head. He's going to hand over this agitation and this sense of unrest that he knows is going to trip him up if he tries to make himself the judge and the policeman in this situation. And he hands it over. And what would people say about that? Well, have a look in verse 6. You know, there are some who would say, who will show us any good? And, you know, who's going to do something about this? And they say, Lord, lift up the light of your countenance upon us. They know that the audience watching might go, well, what good will this do? But we know that if you turn things over to God, he will give you that answer of peace. He will deal with things, and he will certainly take all that emotion off you that distresses you, that worries you, that's hard to manage. And that's why he says in verse 7 and 8, you've put gladness in my heart more than in the season that their grain and wine increased. So he's saying, you can look at and I think this is a reflection of the bad company, the worthless people that seeking falsehood, in verse 2, that he's saying their grain and their wine increase. And that's talking about the harvest. So it's like in the old days, that was the bonanza. That was like payday for the year. You know, the harvest came through, the vineyards were full of grapes, you had wine, the fields were full of all the things you're growing, you had bread, you could feast, you could party, basically. You had money, you had the good times. And that was the time of year to have fun. And he's saying, you've put more gladness in my heart than their payday. You know, he's saying, I've got more peace from my relationship with you, knowing that I can hand over to you, the righteous God, that you will deal with these injustices, than the way they feel right now, having, you know, their party in the harvest time. And that gives him confidence. That makes him feel peaceful and emotionally stable and secure, so that he can get to sleep at night, which is why he says at the end, I will both lie down in peace and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. And that really is a powerful thing to be reminded of. And that word safety at the end there in the Hebrew, that conveys that word more really than the English word safety. It's really saying more things like it's his confidence. It's what makes him feel bold. It's what makes him feel assurance. It makes him feel, you know, strong and stable inside, because he's got this relationship with the Almighty God, who has already said that he gets distressed by the injustice of this world, and it bothers him also when he sees people behaving worthlessly. So he can hand things over to that God day after day after day, and it just takes all the burden and the stress off him about feeling that he's got to make right this world and deal with all the wrongs of this world. And that gives him peace of mind and allows him to get on with his life and to fulfill other things, and it just frees him up. So he feels better for that, and he describes that feeling as better than the feeling that the people get who are chasing around after what we would call more shallow things in life.
I thought as well, with everything you just said, Steve, was so helpful. And I thought back on that point about being angry and being able to sleep and passing over those challenges that you've got to God. You know, that spiritual concepts of the bigger picture in the whole of the Bible in Ephesians 4, I think sheds a bit more light about how don't let the sun go down on your anger, which is exactly what you've just been portraying about. Before he got to his bed, he'd already dealt in his mind, the psalmist had, with how he was going to cope with that. And it was all to do with offloading those things that were weighing him down to his God. And I thought that was another really helpful concept that you'd put for us to think about in how practically we can get to this point at the end of the psalm that you were just talking about.
Yeah.
We had a similar idea in the psalm we did with Sam last week, and it's on there on the screen, Psalm 3 verse 5. I lay down and slept, I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. That was another circumstance where David was, in this case, we think, being chased by people who he'd previously trusted, like Absalom, his son, and other people like Ahithophel, but then they've turned against him. And that betrayal would have been hugely weighing on his mind. But again, he was able to lay down and sleep despite all this stuff that was going on. God hadn't got rid of it. He was still there. He was still having to deal with it, but he was able to put his confidence in God at that time.
Yeah, that's good to be reminded of, Phil, because I've talked a bit about verse 2 and people who are behaving in a shameful way, worthless way, with falsehood, and being a bit sort of woolly really about what those things are. But you've just mentioned a few of the details of the injustices David's having to live with, and he's got his best friend who betrays him, and then even his son Absalom betrays him. One of the most powerful men that lived in the country ever wants him dead, in a sense soldiers after to kill him. So he's got a lot of enemies really, and they're not justified for their actions if we look at those details, which is perhaps something for another day. But David, he was a man who was wronged frequently, so he has good reason to say the things he says in this psalm.
So Steve, you commented at the start that this was one of your favourite psalms. If you could just give one sentence that we could all really take away from this psalm for challenging times, what would it be? What would that lesson be for us to go away and think about this week in relation to Psalm 4?
I suppose in a headline, if your mind just feels crunched up with the problems of life and other people's behaviour, and it's making you angry and troubled, then pray to God. Just give it over to him, let go, and the process of doing that will release you from the burden of those emotions and allow you to sleep at night. So that's what it is to sacrifice righteously, to offer something up. It's to say the right thing to do is to give this up to you, God, and I know you care about me. You're glad to help me. You care about these matters. I'll let go. I'll give it to you. And then you can just turn over and you can sleep better. And that's a nice place to go.
Great. Very powerful. Well, thanks very much, Steve, for sharing that with us. There's a lot there for us to unpack. And if you are feeling challenged in this difficult time, hopefully you can gain some encouragement from what we've been considering today. Back to you then, Jord.
Thanks again. Like Phil said, Steve, I've found that extremely helpful about all those issues that we might have crunched up in our mind, as you put it, which I thought was a nice way of putting it, and knowing that if we can offload these things to God, and it's not wrong to be angry and finding things in life difficult, but we have a God there who David trusted in, that we can find peace in, and we can dwell safely in. So that was really helpful. So thanks, Steve, for your thoughts. I hope you all found that helpful. Next week, we're going to be considering Psalm 5 with another guest, which is really exciting. So have a good week. I hope this psalm can help you in your week, and God bless you all.
God bless. Bye.